Welcome, everyone. Good evening, good day, and good morning, wherever you are. This is a very special evening as we're inaugurating the Gerhard Casper Fellowship, a new fellowship here at the Academy with the lecture Being Black in Europe, Identity and Invisibility by Allison Blakely. We're immensely grateful to the Carnegie Corporation for their support of this fellowship and are forever indebted to our late trustee, Martin Gregorian, whose leadership will be thoroughly missed. This new fellowship that we're inaugurating today honors Gerhard Casper, the former president of Stanford University and a longtime American Academy trustee, for his lifelong commitment to academic excellence and scholarly research. Many of you who have been at the Academy in the past have met Gerhard in person and will know what I'm talking about. You have witnessed Gerhard's integrity, his warmth, his wit, his endless curiosity and critical mind during his tenure here. And when I started to prepare for this introduction tonight, I thought, oh God, talking in public about my former boss, whatever I do, I can only fail. And so I needed a way out of that. What I did was I asked several colleagues of mine and asked them what came to their mind when they thought about Gerhard. And what I will read to you now is a best of the answers. The first thing that was said to me was, oh, he writes these elegant and short letters. Another similar answer was less is more. And also, he has a great humor. He is simply perfect. The next one I have to quote to you in German because this is like, it's very difficult to translate. And also the way it came out from this colleague was quite impressive. It was like, oh, volksnah und sehr umsichtig. And I also heard the person who is at home both in the US and in Germany, and here is also one of my favorites. I really laughed when I heard this. Despite Gerhard being an expert in US constitutional law, he really has a lot of interests. And of course, we all know his world famous, "The Lord be with you." Gerhard, I know you are in the audience. Thank you. We remain deeply grateful to you for your outstanding leadership and continued friendship. And we hope that this fellowship in your honor will serve as a small token of appreciation for all you have done for the Academy, most of all, your permanent emphasis on education and excellence. In your book, The Winds of Freedom, you quote Ulrich von Hutten with, and I quote, "It's a pleasure to live, studies blossom, and the minds move," end quote. And this is where Allison Blakely comes into the play, as a truly mind-moving scholar and the best we can think of for inaugurating this fellowship. Now I will turn to tonight's lecture and the two speakers that we have. I will, as many of you know, introduce the introducer, who will then introduce Alison. Abdoulaye Gueye, who is joining us from Ottawa tonight, kindly agreed to introduce Alison and moderate the question and answer later. He will talk to you about the details and how you will have to behave in a minute. Abdoulaye is a professor of sociology at the University of Ottawa. His current research interests are the formation of Black identity in France and the transformation of higher education in the context of competition and the marketization of knowledge. He is the author of Les Intellectuels Africains en France and Au Nègre de France, la patrie non reconnaissante. His recent fiction book is entitled Oublier la mière patrie. Abdoulaye is also the co-editor of several books, including A Stain on Our Past, Slavery and Memory, and Figures croisées d'intellectuels, Trajectoire, Mode d'Action, Production. He also received several fellowships, among them the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute Residence Fellowship at Harvard University in 2009, and he was in residence at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University in 2015. His research has taken him pretty much all around the world, and I just learned that he has been in Berlin very recently, also funded by a generous grant from the Carnegie Corporation. This is not all. He is also an elected member of the African Studies Association Board of Directors. Thank you so much, Abdoulaye, for joining us tonight. It's a true honor to have you with us, and I turn the virtual floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berit, for this introduction, very generous. It is now my turn to introduce our guest, Professor Allison Blakely, who is a colleague, but also a mentor. Professor Blackley received his BA in US history from the University of Oregon in 1962, and an MA and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in Russian history in 1971. Upon graduation, he joined the Department of History at Howard University. In 2001, he moved to Boston University, where he was appointed George and Joyce Wine Professor of African American Studies and taught European and Comparative History. He retired in 2014 from Boston University, and since then has been holding the title of Emeritus Professor. Professor Blackley is the author of several monographs. His book, Russia and the Negro, Blacks in Russian History and Thought, won the American Book Award in 1988. Another book, Blacks in the Dutch World, The Evolution of Racial Imagery in a Modern Society, is a major title on to Professor Blackley. A former president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, Allison Blakely has also served on the editorial board of his journal, The American Scholar. A world-renowned historian, he is the recipient of many awards and distinctions. This includes fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson, the Mellon, the Ford Foundation, not to mention the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University and the Dutch Royal Institute for Southeastern Asian and Caribbean Studies. Professor Blackley has also been a visiting professor at the Centre d'études africaines at the École des hautes études en sciences sociales in Paris. In addition to this academic distinction, he was awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart medals for his service as a captain in Army intelligence in Vietnam between 1967 and 1968. Currently, he's serving on the National Council for the Humanities, to which he was appointed by President Obama in 2010. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Allison Blakely, and I will be serving as a mediator between the audience and Professor Blakely. I would invite you to post your questions, and I will try to read as many questions as possible. The floor is yours, Alison.
First, I would like to thank the American Academy in Berlin for the honor of being the first Gerhard Casper Fellow this semester. And despite the pandemic preventing my actual residence there, a special thanks as well for this opportunity to share some of my research findings with the Academy's uniquely diverse audience. I want to also thank the Academy's outstanding staff for its assistance and encouragement. And finally, I thank my good friend Abdoulaye Gay for agreeing to moderate this evening's program. Since I first read some of his work over a decade ago, I've considered him a leading authority on this subject, and I've also learned that he's among the most generous authorities and willing to share his knowledge as widely as possible. I've titled my presentation, Being Black in Europe, Identity and Invisibility. I'm going to consider three overarching themes: imposed Black identity, Black self-identity, and Black invisibility in Europe. Reflecting over this has led me to think more broadly about identity formation in society in general than ever before. Since questions surrounding identity in American society are becoming increasingly more complicated in the 21st century. Now, when filling out standard forms, we're frequently prompted to choose your pronoun. And we usually acquiesce without asking by whose authority this new norm came about. And we were not personally consulted beforehand. In order to complete important transactions online, we're required to prove you're not a robot. And sometimes I worry that we are all being forced to become such integral parts of automated protocols that we may not even realize it if we do take on that new identity. On the surface, developments such as these may seem trivial, but it has begun to dawn on me that fundamentally, our ongoing process of identity formation may be the way in which human societies have always rather easily accepted identities that are assigned by governments, religions, and other leading authorities. And this takes on a very serious nature when we apply it to the evolution of Black identities in societies that engaged in the African slave trade. I find it troubling that assignment of identities can occur so easily and arbitrarily. And that's what makes it so unnerving for me that recently corporations have been granted legal personhood in the United States and several other countries and enjoy more legal protection for possible misdeeds than individuals have. This is an unpleasant reminder that we have a system of laws whose flexibility in earlier times rendered my ancestors chattel property, deprived of human rights, while now in the 21st century, corporations can arguably enjoy some human rights more fully than most human beings can. Yet another troubling matter affecting our way of life now is what is called identity theft. Regarding my subject this evening, I would submit that the Atlantic slave trade was the greatest and most successful identity heist in world history. And it was this theft that defines what most distinguishes the identity of Blacks in Europe from that of all other groups there. I should note here that my own definition of Black is inherently ambiguous because the related concepts have always been ambiguous and arbitrary. With respect to European countries that discourage the formal stipulation of racial or ethnic categories by law or tradition, I'm simply counting those who within those societies routinely suffer personal indignities and adverse discrimination because of their skin color or known Black African ancestry, regardless of census categories or whether they want to be called Black. To be Black in Europe is to have a variety of identities imposed upon oneself, beginning with the very designation Black, which people from African cultures obviously did not choose for themselves. Black people in Europe have always been forced to conform to someone else's definition of who and what they are to a greater extent than the white populations. Consequently, all across Europe, the immigrant ancestry of Black people who think of themselves as mainly French, British, Dutch, and so on, is routinely mentioned by the media, even in contexts where that is not even relevant, while white Europeans of immigrant descent are referred to by the nationality of the country in which they reside, or without reference to nationality. There's also a noticeable tendency to attach stigma to migrants of color from Africa and Asia that's not applied to white European migrants. Another form of imposed identity is the widespread preference for stereotypes over real personal characteristics. There are a couple of examples. In the first slide, these are two children's stories written in Europe over 100 years ago that have enjoyed popularity in many countries. And these two iconic entertainers, whom I'm sure most of you will recognize, are depicted here in the style that is most popular, despite the genuine affection for them. To understand how indelible such images can become, consider the extent to which long-standing negative stereotypes are deeply embedded in present-day film, the arts, sports, and advertising. An example often in the news is in soccer, where even Black multimillionaire superstars playing in countries ranging from Spain, United Kingdom, Germany, all the way to Russia have had to endure being called monkeys by chanting crowds and having bananas thrown onto the field. The first Black member of Italy's parliament, Cecile Kyenge, was once several years ago called an orangutan by a former Italian minister, and on another occasion had bananas thrown at her while at a podium. Yet, paradoxically, Poland now has 2 Black Africans in its parliament, and Africans have been elected mayor in at least 2 towns in Russia. So this is a very complicated issue. But it's important to bear in mind that among the barriers to removing the stigma in society related to skin color is that disparaging Blackness can be simultaneously a part of white identity preservation as a marker of superiority. My main frame of reference for my studies on this subject is my lived experience as a Black American scholar who over the past half century has spent visits totaling several years researching in Europe. One of my premises has been that the basic concepts facing or fueling race and color prejudice in Western societies were originally forged in Europe and her many colonies that included what became the United States, and that these concepts are still embedded in a white supremacist ethos that is shared all across Europe as well as in the Americas. Given the formative role of European societies in shaping those in the Americas and Africa, I'm hoping that an overview study of the history of Blacks in Europe as a whole might further inform the ongoing study of race and color prejudice in Western societies in general. Although well aware that there are striking differences regarding this subject among European countries, what immediately struck me most in the early years of my study is how many similarities are evident, even in countries that have not experienced large Black populations. This point was first driven home for me by a dramatic change in the way I was viewed and treated in the Netherlands before and after the independence of Suriname in the mid-1970s, a development that suddenly increased the Black population in the Netherlands by tens of thousands. My initial visits to Amsterdam were for research in the rich archival materials there on Marxism and the Russian Revolution at the International Institute for Social History. And I felt welcome there and around town as an American professor. But in the wake of the new immigration, I began to experience racism there for the first time as I was gaining the ability to speak Dutch in shops and on public transportation and was mistaken for a Black Surinamer. It was the shock from this abrupt change in environment that inspired me to begin intensive study of race and color prejudice in Europe. I was shocked because the Netherlands' global, well-deserved reputation for social and political tolerance and for being an international leader in acceptance of refugees from other parts of the world, it seemed that Dutch society was comfortable with a visiting Black American, but many became uneasy with this sudden influx of large numbers of their own coming to stay. This included, by the way, some Black Dutch citizens already there, as they too were at times mistaken for newcomers. This same reaction occurred in a number of European societies from the 1970s onward. Although I'm still compiling much information on patterns of discrimination in Europe that remind me of that in the United States, I've recently been exploring whether European societies may have one inherent advantage compared to the United States when coping with race and color prejudice related to Blacks. European societies did not practice enslavement at home in their modern history. The United States did, resulting in that becoming one of the major issues that led to its horribly bloody Civil War, a war that succeeded in preserving the Union, but left emotional scars and legal and moral questions that are still unresolved surrounding white supremacy. In the Jim Crow law regime that gradually spread throughout the country after the abolition of slavery, color replaced chains as the main device for social control and economic exploitation. In Europe, on the other hand, entering the 20th century, all but two countries were monarchies that had abolished slavery even earlier than the United States, and all had traditions in which social class mattered more than color. I've long assumed that this is why a wealthy Black person could be welcomed in the finest hotels in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, while in the United States, nearly all hotels were segregated until the second half. European societies have never had to contend with a significantly large Black population that had to transition from being property into an identity as fully human. Europe has nevertheless had the challenge of replacing the mindset of viewing people of Black African descent as property with that acknowledges their full humanity, which is clearly not yet achieved. What I'm positing is that since European societies did not impose the so-called Black codes at home like they did in their colonies, they may have a less deeply entrenched systemic race and color bias in Europe than that in the United States, and more nuanced perceptions of people of Black African descent. And I want to know whether there are other factors besides the importance of class status and absence of slavery there. That is, alternative, less noticed bases of discrimination. This means looking more closely at white European self-identity than I have before, including which actually identify as white, how this has been reflected over the centuries in government policies, local traditions of ethnic or religious exceptionalism, and in folklore and popular culture. There's now a growing number of related works by other scholars that makes this feasible. I must pay more attention to the fact that white Europeans don't think of themselves as Europeans first, any more than Black Africans see their home continent name as their basic identity. And we need only to reflect on Brexit, the Berlin Wall, and the perennial quest for a unified Europe to realize that national and continental identities are dynamic, not static. The issue of Black self-identity in Europe, featuring assertions of a separate identity in Black communities and demands for equality, have a long history in France and England, the European countries with the largest Black populations. This can be seen in the Pan-African Congresses convened in Europe, in European capitals during the 20th century, the African Association founded in London, and the French Negritude movement in France. In Germany, Africans put together a self-help organization called the Afrikanischen Hilfsverein in Hamburg as early as 1920, which was led by the Cameroonian Peter Mukimbe. In the Netherlands, the prominent leader was Anton de Kom from Suriname. Other Europeans showed similar awakenings as that century progressed, emphasizing self-preservation and striving for human dignity, not really spontaneous, unprovoked cultural nationalism. In Spain and Portugal, such thought can be traced as far back as the 16th century, when for a time it's estimated that the Black population of Lisbon was around 10% of the total. Black communities now have felt compelled to organize in order to survive and prosper. But it was not until the beginning of the 21st century when the size of the Black population and other non-white populations was reaching unprecedented levels, that this dilemma concerning Black identity again reached such intensity in Europe that the broad public could no longer ignore it. The Black population in Europe is now conservatively estimated to have passed 2% of the total and is still growing. These estimates should be viewed as basically my rough educated guesses, but they are influenced by those of the United Nations, the European Union, and local organizations, in addition to census data when available. What I wanted here to do is just give you a sense of where the Black population is located in Europe and the proportions. Over the past 2 decades, tens of thousands of Black Africans in desperate pursuit of a better life have migrated through Senegal to Spain's Canary Islands as an entry point, and thousands more through Libya to Italy, despite international efforts to stop that traffic, much of which is illegal. Thousands more have drowned while trying, when overcrowded makeshift boats from both points of departure have capsized. Many more have come or have been brought by European governments to European countries in which their ancestors were colonial subjects. The Black population of Ireland, which is not a former colonial power, is now over 60,000, attracted mainly by the labor market. And you'll see another small country, Norway, has attracted nearly 100,000 over the past 2 decades for work, and like neighboring Scandinavian countries, as a favorite destination for asylum. The reason the immigrant population has continued to grow is that after ending their colonial empires due to declining white population birth rates, the European countries find themselves still highly dependent on non-European immigrants of diverse cultures and colors for sustaining their own economic strength. One clear sign of the impact of declining birth rates in Russia, for example, is that Vladimir Putin has recently enacted policies promoting population increase that harken back to Soviet Russia's drives to help Russia rebuild manpower after losses of tens of millions of citizens during the 20th century to major wars, famine, and political purges. Such special tax breaks and welfare measures are now provided for larger families and first-time mothers. Further west, the Belgian government estimates that without migrants, the working population will shrink by more than 20% over the next 3 decades. On their part, the immigrants come mainly for economic reasons, education, and asylum from dire straits at home, and often with the aim of working to send money home. From the end of the 1950s to the early 80s, Soviet Russia also brought over 50,000 foreign students, mainly from Africa, to study in Russian higher educations in the institutions with unrealized hopes of converting to communism the probable leadership of newly forming countries as Western European colonies were becoming independent. Many of these students stayed in Russia or used it as a transitional base to move on to Western European countries or the United States. At the same time, some European countries, amid concerns about national identity and culture clash, have at times funded unsuccessful repatriation efforts. This includes West Germany in the 1980s and Scandinavian countries more recently. European societies have had to adjust to the indefinite residency of a cheap labor force they originally hoped would be temporary, and in their interactions are pressured to live up to the democratic principles operative within Europe, in contrast to the authoritarian and racist regimes in their former colonial societies. Development of Black consciousness organizations within European countries has been one way the emergent Black communities have dealt with this unresolved paradox of living in predominantly white societies that are ambivalent about becoming more culturally diverse. In the case of France, a dizzying array of Black identity organizations has been established since the 1960s, initially inspired in part by the successes of Black civil rights activists in the United States. Some of the French organizations have acronyms nearly 10 letters long. And France's Representative Council of Black Associations, or CRAN, claims to represent about 120 associations. In Germany, the initiative Schwarze Deutsche ISD was founded in Berlin in 1986 to provide various cultural, political, and social activities, and eventually added affiliates in over 10 cities. In Spain, it was in the 1990s that anti-racist associations such as SOS Racismo in Madrid emerged. And in 2003, the Association of African and Pan-African Studies was founded there. The European Network Against Racism, or ENAR, was established by grassroots activists in 1998 to connect local and national anti-racist non-government organizations. Based in Brussels, it now claims to represent over 150 affiliates throughout the European Union. In addition to such conspicuous organizations, websites of various types of Black organizations in many European countries are growing in number, and in smaller countries, Black consciousness groups organize on Facebook. There are also such practices as sporadic Black History Month, parts of major cities featuring many African shops, hair salons, restaurants, and nightclubs, and published guides with yellow pages to all sorts of Black establishments can be found in Paris and Amsterdam. Churches with Black majorities have also sprung up within all the sizable Black communities. Meanwhile, among Black respondents to one recent European Union survey, 30% say they have been racially harassed in the last 5 years, and 5% have been physically attacked. The most prevalent overt discrimination mentioned by Black organizations occurs in housing, employment, and the practice of racial profiling. As suggested in my introductory remarks, all personal identities are multifaceted, but some aspects are more determinative than others, and this is especially notable with regard to racial discrimination. W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, the touchstone for analyzing the identity crisis being a Black American has long entailed, has been joined over the past century by myriad forms of what in today's field of identity studies in many disciplines is being called triple consciousness. The baseline for Black self-identity in Europe was already a form of triple consciousness, long before Du Bois's famous musings. Black Europeans, unlike Black Americans, are usually aware of their native ethnic identity, which represents their first consciousness. They may even be able to name their ancestral village in Africa or the Caribbean. They adopt the European nationality of the country they live in for their second identity awareness, and they're forced into consciousness of their skin color for their third. Black Americans usually identify by only their color and American nationality. As noted earlier, European societies harbor fewer tangible vestiges of the practice of slavery. However, Afro-Europeans are finding that while sharing the brunt of race and color prejudice is the main force that binds them together, it is simultaneously an obstacle for achieving true unity to promote their equality in European societies. Factors hindering Black unity versus those promoting it in the main European societies include naming. One of the best examples of this is the power of the stigma attached to Blackness itself. For instance, very low percentages of Blacks self-identify in that category in Spain and Portugal and throughout the Hispanic world, including North and South America and the Caribbean. The most spectacular evidence of this is Portugal's offspring, Brazil, the most glaring example of the power of the stigma attached to Blackness. It was not until the 2010 census that the government there recognized that the majority of its always predominantly Black population is Black. And only about 8% of that in that census self-identified as Black. At the same time, the use of such descriptors as African European in Europe clashes with various self-identities among Blacks, just as the term African American does in the United States. I found in surveys of Black attitudes that the highest percentage of Blacks in Europe who self-identify as Black are at a single-digit level. A favorite claim among European societies concerning color bias is that they are colorblind. One reason this pretense cannot succeed is that only the very light complexioned Black Europeans have the option to go along with it. In the rest of the Black population, color consciousness is so widespread and regularly reinforced that use of dangerous skin lightening products by African women in Europe contributes to that global multi-billion-dollar industry. The main positive reinforcement of a Black self-identity is that shared musical traditions, kindred African cuisines, and political and economic needs provide an impetus to unite for cultural and tactical purposes. Black self-identity in Europe has also been greatly enhanced in the 21st century by high-profile achievements by Black elites, and Black Europeans have now become more prominent in several spheres, and very notably in politics. A number are at very top level government posts. Here you see Lady Valerie Amos, who served as the leader of the House of Lords from 2003 to 2007. And here, Christiana Taubira was Minister of Justice in France. But despite scattered examples of very high positions and the growing numbers of mixed race couples in real life and in leading roles in film and television, these developments do not seem to be accompanied by conspicuous improvement in race relations in everyday life, or by Black communities as a whole sharing the success of the elites. Turning now to the issue of Black invisibility in Europe, an important question that is rarely asked is, why is the Black population not much larger? Given the proximity of Europe to Africa, the fact that the Mediterranean has always been more of a connection to Africa than a barrier, and that the Iberian Peninsula that would become Spain and Portugal was ruled for over 700 years by the multi-ethnic Moorish Empire that included sub-Saharan African populations. This surely left a substantial mixed race population even after the formation of modern Europe. A hint of the main reason an identifiable Black population in the early modern period was small can be found in the fact that a statement bandied about by some 19th century European intellectuals to the effect that Africa begins at the Pyrenees has always been deeply resented in Spain. There were efforts going all the way back to the 15th century in Spain to interpret Iberian history as Eurocentric. So-called pure blood laws, originally designed by the Catholic Habsburg dynasty to privilege Christians over those of Muslim and Jewish ancestry, culminated in massive expulsions from Spain in the early 17th century. While the main motivation was religious, a large portion of those expelled were a racially mixed population that by today's standard would be called Black. And Spain was not alone in this type of thinking. Queen Elizabeth I of England between 1596 and 1601 drafted proclamations that, although never enacted, demanded that all Blacks, which in her proclamations were called blackamoors and Negroes, should be expelled from England because they were viewed as own natural subjects. The close association of Blacks with slavery and their denigration as uncivilized led to even free Blacks being considered inferior. European countries prohibiting slavery in Europe was partly motivated by their desire to minimize Black population. They now do this through the formulation of census categories, flexible definitions of Black identity, as well as restrictive immigration. The specious pronouncements about colorblindness further obscure Black presence and the associated social challenges. It's noteworthy that one of the main demands of European Black consciousness organizations is for more visibility for Blacks in all spheres of society. One of the most poignant views I've come across in interviews about being Black in Europe is that of a young woman in Berlin who stated, "I see Black people in many places in the German capital, but I rarely see them working in client-facing roles, in jobs that allow them to engage directly with the public. Their roles tend to be less visible, confined to restaurant kitchens or worse." She added that a friend from Kenya, who also lives in Berlin, once asked her, "Why do bathroom attendants have to be African?" The standard justification for avoiding taking into account a Black person's color in census categories, for example, is that it risks reprising data collection processes employed during the time leading up to the Holocaust. The ghost of the Holocaust also buttresses an unspoken taboo about public discussion of race and discrimination in many European societies. This reinforces the Black invisibility already operative due to the absence of European colonial history in school curriculums and of related categories in library catalogs. Consequently, the public is deprived of an ability to place the current situation in historical context. Such invisibility means that the presence and needs of communities suffering from discrimination and inequality cannot be identified and influence public policy. The study and discussion of what it means to be Black in Europe is finally beginning to receive the attention it deserves. But at this point, it appears to me that what the Afro-European faces is a conundrum. Most seem very happy to be in Europe, but they point out, if they point out the serious needs to address racial and color bias that they live with, they risk accusations of being racist themselves or unpatriotic. As a closing observation, I'd like to point out that a number of Black American and European writers have eloquently shown awareness that there can also be an advantage in this dilemma, which Paul Gilroy in his The Black Atlantic calls the quote, special conditions of existence of Black cultures that have been, quote, forged out of the experience of racial subordination. The Surinamer Dutch sociologist Rudolf van Leer had earlier stated in a newspaper interview in 1987, I quote, "I have had the privilege of being born on the edge of groups and civilizations. I proceed upon the assumption that an intellectual is marginal by definition. And I was born there, between civilizations. What a privilege, end quote. That is what I am suggesting regarding Black Europeans possibly having a distinctive contribution to make as this type of outsider. What discourages me most about our American variety of race and color prejudice is its durability. When I note that the beginning lines of Du Bois's first essay in The Souls of Black Folks at the beginning of the 20th century reads, quote, between me and the other world is an ever unasked question. That is, how does it feel to be a problem? The fact that we're still wrestling with this issue is reflected in Ta-Nehisi Coates' title of his 2015 letter to his son, Between the World and Me, a title he borrowed directly from a 1939 poem by Richard Wright about lynching. And Ta-Nehisi Coates' work resonated so well that when first released, it remained near the top of the New York Times bestsellers list for over a year. These underscore countless other forms of evidence that very little has changed about how people of Black African descent in the United States relate to the society we're part of. At the same time, our current political and cultural struggles in American society have laid bare through the recent presidential election and backlash riot that nearly half the population is willing to sacrifice traditional democratic ideals now because this democracy's white majority is on the verge of becoming just a plurality. And that half of the population is willing to place in power the pre-modern ethos of the slave society that the Civil War was supposed to have conquered a century and a half ago, if that is the only way to preserve white privilege. By contrast, in following current events in Europe, I noticed that white supremacist political and cultural groups and parties abound, but they seem no longer to gain traction for very long. This may suggest that Blacks in Europe might be facing less formidable obstacles to progress on race relations than we in the United States, perhaps because their societies have more recently experienced white supremacist rule and found that it is not conducive to sustained wealth, power, and peace in a globalized world. It is to be hoped that more Blacks in Europe will follow the examples of Van Leer and Gilroy in embracing the awkward and often painful position in which they find themselves, that of sometimes vagabond and outsider, and will continue to use this vantage point to inform their European societies from the benefit of their unique perspective. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our conversation about what I've sketched.
Thank you so much, Alison, for this exciting presentation. I'm going to invite the audience to post their questions. I will be scrolling the chat in order to pick a few of these questions and ask them and submit them to Alison. But before I move on to the audience, I have a few questions that I would like to discuss with Alison. One of the first question is with regard to the way in which the acceptance of Black people in Europe and the United States has been framed in your presentation. You seem to suggest that actually there has been more acceptance of Black people in Europe for many years compared to what happened in the United States. And something that we are both, how to say, interested in history, and we, I guess, both have read also the work done by Tyler Stovall on Black France in particular. When you read the Paris Noir by Tyler Stovall, if my memory is correct, there was one place where he was discussing the creation of a police dedicated specifically to the surveillance of Black people in France in the 18th century. So although there was no slavery on the French soil, I mean, continental France, I mean, there still was a police whose job was to prevent Black people from settling in continental France. How do you relate this to your idea that Europeans and France in particular was more accepting Black people than the United States?
Well, I guess the fact that they succeeded in keeping them out really until the 20th century removed some of the evidence that we need to have in order for me to decide whether my sense of greater acceptance is valid. If there weren't very many that were staying, and as I understand it, they were only allowed to stay for a short period of time, especially since many of those that were coming were slaves. They were allowed to come because of their slaves masters. So during the period when slavery was still in force, I think it was a different issue. Even in the United States, during the period of slavery, and even more recently, if everything was geared to the benefit of the white male, that status conveyed. And so, and I'm a native of Alabama, even in Alabama, a white man, if he wanted to have a white woman, a Black woman in any capacity, or even his servants, they would be respected in town on the same level as that white master. So that kind of a relationship, I think, has to be taken into consideration in those cases where you had Blacks who were still thought of as inferior in every way, but they had to be treated differently. And I think what I was referring to in talking about the Black people with wealth who could live like a normal person on the surface in Europe, and yet in the United States could not. It goes back, and I was trying to attribute that to class status. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Black person was elevated in the estimation of the European. But even from the perspective of the Black person, many times in the civil rights movement, for example, the argument was used, you can't change people's hearts by legislation. And I always explained to people I didn't care whether their heart was changed or not, if they treated me like a human being, and we would work on the heart later. And so that's my attitude toward that.
Yeah. Another question that I would like to ask also, because I see a few questions in the chat that are pretty much referring to this question, is your analysis of the visibility, invisibility of Black people. I have this quote in my mind by James Baldwin from his book, No Name in the Street. And what James Baldwin was saying in the book very clearly is, okay, we have been here for 400 years, but you have never seen us. That's what he said. So this length of time, of course, I mean, if you live with somebody for 400 years and not seeing this person, it means to a certain extent that, you know, this person does not exist. This person is invisible. And what I understood from James Baldwin's statement is that actually the lack of visibility of Black people in the United States is something that has to be understood in relationship with the lack of vocality of Black people in the United States. That is the fact that these generations of Black people in the United States did not speak out, and as a result, they were not visible. Are we having something similar in Europe and I would say in France or Germany or any other place? Because there was a time when Blacks were just immigrants. They say, okay, we are guests, we don't have to speak out, even though we are suffering. And now we have several generations, I mean, second, third generation, even in certain places. And this generation is becoming more vocal. Is this the reason why we are seeing more organizations such as Crown, such as the other association that you have mentioned come to existence?
Well, my study of the history in both continents is not consistent with that picture. I think, for example, for a very long time, it was thought in the United States that slaves never revolted. And with the explosion of historical and other cultural kinds of studies, it turned out there was a great deal of rebellion, and it took all kinds of forms. And I think uh, this issue of what's done for appearances, that is, what's done in order to cope with the situation you're in. Well, Fanon explained it. You wear the mask, you know, and that's always been a part of it. There were people have been very skillful if they're persecuted at finding ways to cope, but not necessarily having their spirits killed. And you can even see it, in the let's say the Du Bois, Booker T. Washington kind of confrontation at the early 20th century. If you read correspondences in Washington's letters and others of his correspondence letters, you'll find a different image of Booker T. Washington than you do if you just accept the fact that this was a man who said it wasn't yet time for Black people to be fully educated or to demand political equality. And Du Bois was saying it's past time. Well, underneath, Washington, in many respects, agreed with him, but he was trying to do what he thought was pragmatic to try to bring progress as soon as possible to the largest number of people. And I think he felt Du Bois was putting the emphasis on the elites, on the so-called talented 10th.
Yeah, correct. Another question from the audience. This is the following. This is the question: does it appear that the Western European countries accept Blacks more readily than Eastern European countries, in your view?
You know, it's complicated. I know that's a cop out, but if you're talking about the people, I think you have to make a distinction between the people and the government. And maybe I'm influenced by my long study of Russian history. In the height of the early Soviet period, when their ideology, as reflected in the Soviet Constitution, for example, where everything was supposed to be free and equal and so on. Well, that was on the surface. There's a record of a meeting of Africans and African Americans who were in the Soviet Union at the time at the political schools. They were formally complaining to the Communist International that they were experiencing all kinds of racism. Some were being spat on. They were complaining about the nature of the shows on stage and films that were racist and so on. So you have to make a distinction between theory and practice. And in the Eastern countries, that's even Eastern Germany, I think, during that period, they put a certain face on what they were doing, but that didn't necessarily change what the people were thinking. And so often the ordinary people were expressing common European values. And I'm going all the way, for example, I at one point discovered that the Russians also, at a very early point in the Middle Ages, were familiar with the Curse of Ham legend. And that influenced uh, that Eastern Orthodox faith, just as in the West, you had the Catholic Church to some extent be a part of the promoter of that kind of thinking.
There's a question from the audience regarding the concept, the difference that you highlight between double consciousness by Du Bois and the new concept of triple consciousness. So we are asking you to expand a little bit on the difference. But before I let you do so, please, I would like just to highlight the fact that, I mean, not the fact, but this is a question related to this question. To what extent what we are witnessing right now, this frenzied, DNA test phenomenon within the African American population, and also since the movie Roots or the book Roots, whatever. So to what extent could we say that with this frenzied test phenomenon, DNA test phenomenon, we are moving toward the existence of a triple consciousness within the African American population?
Well, there is a direct comparison that can be made with African immigrants to the United States. See, at the time Du Bois was writing, we didn't have very many Africans directly from Africa. Those from Africa, they have a triple consciousness in the same way they do in Europe.
This person in the audience is asking you if you can tell us a bit about your experience in Russia as a Black person.
Oh, that would take up all the rest of the time.
Let's take 2 minutes, man. Let's take just a couple of minutes.
Well, my first visit to Russia happened to be in 1965. It was for an intensive language study tour. It was 5 weeks at the University of Indiana in Bloomington, pledged to speak only Russian, and then off to Russia for 6 weeks touring in Transcaucasia and the Caucasus region, as well as European Russia. And at that time, as a graduate student at Berkeley, I was deep into the Russian history, and I'd not had direct experience with Russian communism. And I found myself surprised by what occurred during that visit. I happened to be in Moscow at the time of the Watts riot, and I and my Russian counterparts were reading the newspapers, and at one point we're looking at photographs from the United States. There was this one photograph with a line of young Black men who were down on the ground, on their stomachs, handcuffed behind their backs. And I was expecting my Soviet counterparts to express some sympathy and so on. But instead, the first thing they said was, "But look at those shoes." And I was just flabbergasted. And later, I sort of understand it in those years, and even now, material kinds of interests are much more important to the regular population than ideology. But I was just shocked. And then I also learned from some of my fellow students who explained to me that when I was away from the group, some of the Russians, taxi drivers and others, would tell them, we agree with you about those blacks. So what was, again, on a theoretical level, the propaganda was not being backed up. And that was my first visit. Later visits, I was more alert and understood, but it was safer when the government was in full control under the Communist Party, in terms of what I said earlier about being treated well. I was often treated well, but in the most recent visits, actually, it was really bad at the beginning of the 21st century, because the skinheads, there were something like 60,000 skinheads organized into gangs, and the government was calling them youth clubs, and they would go to their summer training camps and speak. But what happened in more recent times is the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, the skinheads, they got out of hand and were actually trying to ignore the control of the government. And so Mr. Putin has brought them under control. So I think despite all the propaganda and the glowing language of the constitutions, racism is alive and well in Russia, but it varies from who's in control as to whether you will experience it directly very much.
We could go on forever, but now it's 8:45 and we were supposed to stop at 8:45 exactly. So
I spoke too long. I'm sorry, but
that's fine. Thank you. I mean, I hope that the audience will join me to thank Professor Allison Blackley, and thank you very much, Alison, for this insightful presentation. And now I'm going to hand the floor to Berit.
Thank you both. Thank you, Abdullah, for the great moderation, and thank you, Alison, for an excellent lecture. We have way more questions than we can take, and what we will do is we will all pass them on to Alison, who can happily deal with them. And he's smiling. I see him smiling, so I interpret this as a positive sign. Our next event will be taking place on Thursday with Philip Schmitter, who will be talking about the integration of the European Union and the various theories, and why neo-functionalism is still the most valid and current theory. Thank you so much, and thank you both. Bye-bye.